The moment Claire walked through those glass doors, she knew she'd made a mistake. The noise hit her like a physical wall, screaming children, the aggressive beep of cash registers, the sizzle of fryers working overtime, and underneath it all, the low rumble of dozens of conversations happening at once. Her fingers tightened around the worn leather wallet in her pocket, the same one her mother had given her years ago, back when things were simpler, back before everything changed. She'd promised her father she'd try. That was the deal they'd made 3 days ago when the moving truck pulled away from their old house, leaving behind everything familiar. "Just give it a chance," he'd said, his voice carrying that mixture of hope and exhaustion that had become so common lately. "New town, fresh start. You might even like it here." Claire had nodded, not because she believed him, but because she could see how much he needed her to believe it. Officer Blake Harrison had given up a lot for this transfer. Friends, colleagues who felt like family, a community where everyone knew his name. The least she could do was pretend to be optimistic. But standing here now, in the chaotic heart of this restaurant on a Saturday afternoon, optimism felt like a foreign concept. The place was packed with what seemed like half the town's population, under 25. Groups of teenagers occupied the larger tables, their voices competing to be heard over one another. Families with small children navigated the narrow spaces between booths, trays balanced precariously in their hands. Office workers in wrinkled business casual attire hunched over their meals, scrolling through their phones with the desperate energy of people stealing a few minutes of freedom. Claire took her place at the end of the line, positioning herself behind a woman with 3 young children who were currently engaged in a heated debate about whether chocolate or strawberry milkshakes were superior. She kept her eyes down, studying the pattern of the tile floor, white squares with small black diamonds at the corners, scuffed from years of foot traffic. It was easier than making eye contact with strangers, easier than risking the kind of attention she'd spent most of her 17 years trying to avoid. Her blonde hair fell forward as she bent her head, creating a curtain between herself and the world. She'd always been this way, even as a child. While other kids pushed to the front of every line, raised their hands enthusiastically in class, and seemed to draw energy from crowds, Claire felt drained by it all. Her mother used to call her their quiet storm, calm on the surface, but with depths that ran deeper than most people suspected. That was before the accident, before everything fell apart, before it became just Claire and her father against the world. The line moved forward slowly. Claire could feel sweat beginning to form on her palms. Why was ordering food always so stressful? She'd rehearsed what she wanted in her head 3 times already. Cheeseburger meal, medium, with a Coke. Simple, straightforward, nothing that would require follow-up questions or complicated decisions. But her mind still raced with possibilities of things going wrong. What if they asked her something she didn't understand? What if she fumbled with her money? What if her voice came out too quiet and she had to repeat herself while a line of impatient people waited behind her? She forced herself to take a slow breath, something her father had taught her. "When everything feels overwhelming," he'd say, "just focus on your breathing. In for 4 counts, out for 4 counts. It tells your brain that you're safe, even when you don't feel safe." It helped, a little. Enough that when she finally reached the counter and the teenager with a name tag that read Josh asked for her order, she managed to get the words out without her voice shaking too badly. The transaction completed, Claire collected her receipt and stepped aside, finding a spot near the pickup counter where she could wait without being in anyone's way. She studied the restaurant more carefully now, taking in details. The walls were covered with posters advertising limited-time menu items and community events. There was a children's play area in one corner, currently occupied by a birthday party that seemed to involve at least a dozen screaming kids. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in a harsh, unforgiving glow that made everyone look slightly tired and washed out. "Order 43!" a voice called out, and Claire stepped forward to collect her tray. The cheeseburger sat in its branded wrapper, the fries scattered beside it in their red cardboard container, and the Coke perspiring in its plastic cup. It looked exactly like every fast food meal she'd ever had, and there was something oddly comforting about that consistency. Finding a seat proved more challenging than ordering. Most of the booths were occupied, and the few empty tables were cluttered with the debris of previous diners. But then she spotted it. A booth by the window recently vacated, with a view of the parking lot and the street beyond. It was perfect, tucked away enough to feel private, but not so isolated that she'd stand out. She moved quickly, sliding into the seat before anyone else could claim it. The vinyl cushion squeaked under her weight. Claire arranged her tray carefully in front of her, positioning everything just so. Burger in the center, fries to the right, drink to the left. Then she unwrapped the cheeseburger partially, just enough to take a bite without making a mess. She'd developed these little rituals over the years, small ways of creating order in a world that so often felt chaotic. The first bite was exactly what she'd expected, warm, salty, thoroughly average. But it was food, and she was hungrier than she'd realized. She'd skipped breakfast, too nervous about venturing out into the town on her own. Her father had offered to come with her, but she'd declined. How was she supposed to prove she could handle this new life if she needed her dad to escort her everywhere? Through the window, she watched cars pull in and out of the parking lot. A young couple argued beside a beaten-up sedan. An elderly man moved slowly with a walker, taking his time despite the impatient driver waiting for his parking spot. Life in motion, everyone busy with their own dramas and destinations. Claire had always found something soothing about watching people from a distance like this, close enough to observe, but far enough to remain apart. She didn't notice them at first, the group of boys at the far end of the restaurant occupying a large corner booth that could comfortably seat 6, but held only 5. They'd been there when she walked in, but she'd been too focused on her own mission to register them as anything more than background noise. Now, though, as she reached for a fry, she felt it, that prickling sensation on the back of her neck, the awareness that comes from being watched. Claire's hand froze halfway to her mouth. She didn't look up, not yet. Maybe she was imagining it. Maybe her anxiety was playing tricks on her, making her paranoid. But no, there it was again. The unmistakable feeling of eyes on her, assessing, judging, calculating. She risked a glance up, just a quick flicker of her gaze toward that corner booth. 5 boys, probably around her age, maybe a year or 2 older. They wore the uniform of teenage rebellion, oversized hoodies despite the warm weather, baseball caps pulled low, chains hanging from their necks that caught the light when they moved. But it was their attitude that marked them more than their clothes. The way they sprawled across their seats, like they owned not just the booth, but the entire restaurant. The careless loudness of their laughter. The casual cruelty in their eyes as they looked at her and then at each other, sharing some joke she wasn't privy to. Claire's stomach clenched. She knew this type. Every school had them. The kids who operated on a different set of rules, who'd learned early that the world would bend to their will as long as they pushed hard enough. She'd managed to avoid their notice at her old school by becoming practically invisible, by never drawing attention, never standing out. But here, in this new place where she was still an unknown quantity, she was vulnerable in a way she hadn't been in years. One of them, the one who seemed to be the ringleader based on the way the others kept looking to him for reactions, nudged his friend and said something. Even from across the restaurant, Claire could see his lips move, could see the smirk that followed. The others laughed, and the sound carried over the general noise of the restaurant like a warning bell. "Don't come over here," Claire thought desperately. "Please just stay where you are. Let me eat my food in peace. Let me be invisible." But the universe had never been particularly responsive to her prayers. The ringleader stood up, stretching with exaggerated casualness. He was tall, with dark hair sticking out from under his cap, and the kind of swagger that came from never having been truly afraid of anything. He said something else to his friends, and they rose too, a pack moving with coordinated purpose. They were coming toward her. Claire's hands started to shake. She set down her burger carefully, not trusting herself to hold it steady. Her mind raced through options. She could get up and leave, but they were blocking the most direct path to the door. She could move to a different table, but that would just draw more attention, make her look weak. She could sit here and hope they passed by, that their destination was somewhere else, someone else. The shadows fell across her table like storm clouds blocking out the sun. Claire looked up slowly, reluctantly, meeting the eyes of the boy who stood directly in front of her booth. Up close, she could see he was probably 18 or 19, with a thin scar cutting through one eyebrow, and the kind of practiced sneer that suggested he'd spent considerable time perfecting it. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with false friendliness. "Look what we've got here. Fresh face in town. Haven't seen you around before, sweetheart." Claire's throat felt like it was closing. She managed to force out a response, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just moved here. This week." "She speaks," one of the other boys exclaimed, mocking amazement. "Thought maybe you were one of those stuck-up types who thinks they're too good to talk to people." More laughter. It seemed to come from all directions, surrounding her, trapping her. Claire felt her face flush hot with embarrassment and something else. Anger, maybe, or shame, at her own inability to defend herself. The ringleader leaned his hand on her table, his weight making the surface tilt slightly toward him. "Name's Tyler. These are my boys, Jake, Rico, Dean, and Scotty. We kind of run things around here, know all the players, all the spots. You're going to want to be friends with us if you plan on having any kind of social life in this town." There was a threat embedded in that statement, thinly veiled as advice. Claire recognized it for what it was. She'd seen this dynamic before, read about it in books, watched it play out in movies. The powerful preying on the vulnerable, establishing dominance, testing boundaries to see what they could get away with. "I'm Claire," she said quietly, hoping that giving them what they wanted, acknowledgement, engagement, might satisfy them enough to leave. "Claire," Tyler repeated, drawing out her name like he was tasting it. "Pretty name. Fits you. Got that whole innocent thing going on." He reached forward suddenly, and before Claire could react, he'd plucked a fry from her tray and popped it into his mouth. "Nice. Thanks for sharing." "I didn't—" Claire started, but Jake cut her off. "Didn't what?" "Didn't offer. That's not very friendly, new girl. We're trying to welcome you here, and you're going to be stingy with your fries." This can't be happening, Claire thought. This can't actually be happening. But it was. Rico had slid into the booth beside her, trapping her against the window. Dean stood at the end of the table, blocking her only exit route. Scotty hovered behind Tyler, grinning like this was the most entertainment he'd had all week. "Please," Claire said, hating how small her voice sounded, how weak. Can you let me eat? I'm not trying to cause any problems." "Problems?" Tyler's eyebrows shot up in exaggerated surprise. "Who said anything about problems? We're just being neighborly, right, boys?" A chorus of agreement. Rico's shoulder pressed against hers, forcing her harder against the window. She could feel the cold glass through her thin shirt. Jake reached across the table and grabbed her cheeseburger, taking an enormous bite before setting it back down. "Hey!" The protest escaped before Claire could stop it, louder than she'd intended. "Hey!" Tyler mimicked, his voice high and mocking. "What are you gonna do about it, Claire? Gonna cry? Gonna call someone? Call someone." The words triggered something in her mind. Her father, Officer Blake Harrison. He was probably at home right now, maybe unpacking more boxes, maybe reviewing case files for his new job. He'd told her to text him when she got to the restaurant, when she was heading home. He'd made her promise to check in, not because he didn't trust her, but because he worried. because he was her dad, and worrying was part of the job description. But Claire couldn't call him, wouldn't call him. What would that prove? That she was exactly as incapable as she feared. That she couldn't handle even the simplest social interaction without backup. Number. She had to deal with this herself, had to find some way to make them leave without escalating things further. "I don't want any trouble," she said again, trying to keep her voice steady. "Please just leave me alone." Tyler leaned in closer, close enough that she could smell the grease and salt on his breath. "See, here's the thing, Claire. You walked into our territory. This is our spot, our restaurant, our town. And we don't appreciate outsiders coming in here acting like they're better than us with their quiet little attitudes and their judgmental looks." "I wasn't," Claire protested, but Scotty interrupted. "Sure looked like judgment to me, the way you've been sitting here all alone, not talking to anyone, acting like you're too good for the rest of us." It was absurd. The logic made no sense. But Claire was beginning to understand that logic wasn't the point. This wasn't about anything she'd actually done. This was about power, about entertainment, about 5 bored boys finding a target and deciding to make her afternoon miserable for their own amusement. Dean grabbed her drink and took a long pull from the straw, his eyes never leaving hers. It was a violation, intimate in its invasiveness, and Claire felt something inside her crack. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not cry in front of these people, would not give them that satisfaction. Around them, the restaurant continued its normal rhythm. Claire could see other patrons glancing over, registering the scene, and then quickly looking away. No one intervened, no one said anything. It was easier to pretend not to notice, to focus on their own meals, their own conversations. Getting involved meant risking becoming the next target. And who wanted that? "You know what I think," Tyler said, settling into the seat across from her like he planned to stay a while. "I think you're scared. I think you're one of those girls who goes through life being scared of everything, and that's why you've got no friends, no life, nothing interesting about you at all." Each word landed like a physical blow. The worst part was that some of it was true. She was scared. She did struggle with social situations, but that didn't give them the right to do this, to take her food, to trap her, to mock her. "What's the matter?" Rico whispered in her ear, his voice oily and intimate. "Cat got your tongue?" Claire tried to slide toward the aisle, to somehow squeeze past Rico and escape, but he shifted his weight, blocking her more completely. His arms stretched across the back of the booth, caging her in. Panic began to claw its way up her chest, making it hard to breathe. This was escalating beyond typical teenage bullying. This was starting to feel dangerous. "Let me out," she said, and this time there was something harder in her voice. Fear transforming into anger, desperation sharpening her words. "Let me out right now." "Or what?" Tyler challenged. "What are you gonna do, Claire? You gonna make us?" The table erupted in laughter again, louder this time, drawing more attention from the surrounding diners. Claire's humiliation was complete, total, suffocating. She couldn't remember ever feeling this helpless, this exposed. Even after her mother's death, even during the worst days of grief and adjustment, she'd at least had control over her own space, her own body. But here, trapped in this booth with these boys leering at her, she had nothing. And then, cutting through the chaos like a lighthouse beam through fog, came a voice that changed everything. "Is there a problem here?" The words were calm, measured, but carrying an undercurrent of absolute authority that made every person within earshot freeze. Claire's head snapped up, and her eyes met her father's across the small distance between them. Officer Blake Harrison stood beside the booth in full uniform, his presence commanding in a way that had nothing to do with the badge on his chest and everything to do with the man wearing it. He was tall, 6'3" in his boots, with broad shoulders that came from years of both gym work and actual physical labor. His hair, dark brown shot through with grey at the temples, was cut military short. But it was his eyes that held the real power. Grey-blue and sharp, they took in the entire scene in seconds. His daughter trapped against the window, the 5 boys surrounding her, her half-eaten meal scattered across the table, her face pale with stress. Claire felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Relief so intense it made her dizzy, embarrassment that her father had to see her like this, had to rescue her, shame that she couldn't handle this herself, but above all, gratitude, pure, overwhelming gratitude that he was here. Tyler had turned to face the newcomer, and for just a moment his confidence faltered. Then he recovered, plastering on that same smirk he'd been wearing since he approached Claire's table. Just talking, officer. Making conversation with the new girl. No law against being friendly, is there? Blake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. When he spoke, his voice remained level, but there was steel underneath. Funny. From where I'm standing, it looks like you're stealing her food, physically blocking her into a seat and making her extremely uncomfortable. None of that falls under my definition of friendly. She's fine, Jake said, trying to sound casual but unable to quite meet Blake's eyes. We're all just hanging out, right, Claire? All eyes turned to her. This was it. The moment where she either backed them up or told the truth. And despite her fear, despite her desire to avoid conflict, despite every instinct that told her to minimize and diffuse the situation, Claire found herself saying, "No, I'm not fine. I want them to leave me alone." Her voice was quiet, but in the silence that had fallen over their corner of the restaurant, it carried clearly. Blake nodded once, acknowledging her words, validating her. He took a step closer to the booth, and suddenly he seemed even larger, more imposing. His hand rested near his belt, not on his weapon, but close enough that the implication was clear. This was a police officer, a trained professional, someone who had been in genuinely dangerous situations and knew how to handle them. 5 teenage boys with attitude problems didn't even register on his threat scale. "Here's how this is going to work," Blake said, his voice dropping lower, more dangerous. "You 5 are going to back away from my daughter. You're going to walk out of this restaurant quietly and calmly, and you're going to remember that harassment, theft, and intimidation are actual crimes that I could charge you with if I felt so inclined." "Your daughter?" Tyler's smirk finally disappeared completely, replaced by something closer to concern. The power dynamic had shifted dramatically, and he was smart enough to recognize it. "My daughter," Blake confirmed. "Officer Blake Harrison recently transferred to the local department, which means I'm going to be around this town for a long time. I'm going to get to know a lot of people. And trust me when I say that the 5 of you really don't want to be on my radar." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. This wasn't just a protective father speaking. This was a law enforcement official with the power to make their lives significantly more complicated. The boys exchanged glances, their earlier bravado evaporating. Rico was the first to move, sliding out of the booth and backing away from Claire. Dean stepped aside, clearing the exit path. Scotty and Jake retreated toward their original table, suddenly very interested in collecting their trash. Only Tyler remained for a moment longer, trying to salvage some shred of dignity. "Whatever, man. She's not even that interesting anyway." Blake's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. "Walk away." Now, while I'm still feeling generous enough to pretend this was just a misunderstanding. Tyler went. The 5 boys gathered their belongings and headed for the door, moving faster than they probably wanted to, their postures screaming wounded pride and suppressed fear. The door swung shut behind them, and the normal sounds of the restaurant rushed back in to fill the void they'd left, conversations resuming, children laughing, the beep of the register. Blake waited until they were completely gone before he turned his full attention to Claire. His expression softened immediately, the hard edges of Officer Harrison melting back into Dad. He slid into the booth across from her, the same seat Tyler had occupied just minutes before, but his presence felt entirely different. Safe, solid, home. "You okay, kiddo?" he asked gently. Claire nodded, then shook her head, then nodded again. Her emotions were too tangled to sort out. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Sorry?" Blake's eyebrows drew together in confusion. "What do you have to be sorry for?" "I should have handled it. I should have been stronger. I should have—" "Hey." Blake reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His palm was warm, calloused from years of work. "Listen to me. What happened here was not your fault. Those boys chose to harass you. You didn't invite it, didn't deserve it, and you have absolutely nothing to apologize for." "But I just sat here. I didn't fight back, didn't—" "You told them to stop. You told them you weren't fine when they tried to make it seem like everything was okay. That takes courage, Claire. Real courage isn't about being aggressive or confrontational. Sometimes it's about holding your ground and telling the truth even when you're scared." The tears Claire had been holding back finally spilled over. Not sobs, just quiet streams down her cheeks that she wiped away quickly with the back of her hand. Blake pulled a clean napkin from the dispenser and handed it to her. "I hate being like this," she said. "I hate that I get scared so easily, that I can't just be normal." Blake was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "You know what I see when I look at you? I see someone incredibly brave. You've been through more in your 17 years than most people deal with in a lifetime. You lost your mom. You moved to a new town. You walked in here today even though crowds make you anxious because you promised me you'd try. That's not weakness, Claire. That's strength. It doesn't feel like strength. It rarely does in the moment. But trust me, from where I'm sitting, you're one of the toughest people I know." Claire managed a watery smile. Her father always knew how to make her feel better, even when her entire world felt like it was crumbling. She looked down at her tray, the burger with Jake's bite taken out of it, the fries scattered and cold, the drink Dean had contaminated with his mouth. "I think I've lost my appetite," she said. Blake stood up. "Tell you what, let me get you a fresh meal, everything new, and I'll sit here with you while you eat it. I was coming in to grab coffee anyway." He paused, and a slight smile crossed his face. "Oh, that's what I'll say if you want to maintain some dignity. The truth is, I was checking up on you because I'm a worrier and couldn't help myself." Despite everything, Claire laughed. "I knew it. I knew you were going to do that. What can I say? It's in the Dad Handbook. Page 1, always worry about your kid, especially when they insist they're fine." He went to the counter, and Claire watched him order, noting how even in casual interaction he commanded respect. People moved aside slightly, gave him space, acknowledged him with nods. This was what confidence looked like. This was what she wanted to become. Someone who moved through the world with that kind of certainty, that kind of presence. Blake returned with a fresh tray, new burger, new fries, new drink, and a coffee for himself. He settled back into the booth and pushed the tray toward her. "Eat. Don't let those punks ruin your afternoon any more than they already have." Claire picked up a fry hesitantly. It was hot, fresh, salty. Good. She took a bite of the burger and gradually her appetite returned. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, and Claire felt the tension slowly draining from her shoulders. "Do you think they'll try something again?" she asked eventually. Blake considered the question seriously. "Honestly, maybe. Guys like that don't like being embarrassed, and I embarrassed them pretty thoroughly in front of a crowd. But here's what you need to understand. They're cowards. They only targeted you because they thought you were alone and vulnerable. Now they know you're not. Now they know that if they mess with you, they're messing with me too. I don't want you to have to fight my battles. I'm not fighting your battles. I'm standing beside you while you fight them. There's a difference. You stood up for yourself today, Claire. You told them no, told them you weren't okay with what they were doing. That's huge. The fact that I was here to back you up doesn't diminish that. Claire wanted to believe him, wanted to feel proud of herself instead of ashamed. Maybe, with time, she would. For now, it was enough to sit here with her father, eating hot fries and feeling safe. They finished their meal without further incident. The restaurant had returned to its normal chaos, the drama of earlier already forgotten by most of the patrons. As they prepared to leave, Blake gathered both trays. "Tell you what," he said, "how about we make this our thing? Every Saturday afternoon we come here, grab lunch together. That way, you're not walking into potentially uncomfortable situations alone, and I get quality time with my daughter. Win-win." Claire smiled, genuine this time. "I'd like that." As they walked toward the exit, Blake's arm draped casually over her shoulders. Claire felt something shift inside her. She was still scared of crowds, still anxious about social situations, still grieving the life she'd left behind. But she also felt something else. Hope. Maybe this new town wouldn't be so terrible. Maybe, with her father beside her, she could learn to be brave in her own way. The afternoon sun hit them as they stepped outside, warm and bright after the artificial light of the restaurant. Claire took a deep breath, feeling the fresh air fill her lungs. Behind them, the Mcdonald's continued its busy rhythm, indifferent to the small drama that had played out within its walls. But for Claire, everything had changed. She'd been tested, had been pushed to her limits, and had survived. And more importantly, she'd learned that asking for help, or having someone appear to offer it, wasn't weakness. It was part of being human, part of being connected to other people who cared. As they walked toward Blake's truck, Claire glanced back at the restaurant one more time. Somewhere out there, those 5 boys were probably nursing their wounded egos, maybe plotting revenge, maybe learning a lesson. Either way, she was ready, because she wasn't alone anymore. She had never really been alone, and that made all the difference in the world.